130,000 women. That was the final count of prisoners who passed through the gates. Some survived, most did not. Who lived and who died? At the time, the female guards of Ravensbrück decided the answer. They wore gray uniforms and carried heavy whips. They believed they were untouchable. But when the war ended, their power vanished instantly. Why did the world turn its eyes to these women? They were not soldiers, but their cruelty shocked even the most experienced investigators. They faced charges for crimes that broke every human law. The stories told in court made battle-hardened men turn away. Justice moved slowly, then all at once. It ended with trials, death sentences, and public executions. The crowds who watched never spoke of anything else again. May 1939. This was the starting point. Only months before the Second World War began, Nazi Germany constructed a new camp. They chose a quiet lakeside town called Ravensbrück. It sat 90 kilometers north of Berlin. The location was a calculated choice. It was isolated from major cities to hide the screams. Yet it remained close to the main rail lines for easy transport. The camp had one specific purpose. It was not like Dachau or Buchenwald. Ravensbrück was built entirely for women. It was the only major camp in the Nazi system designed specifically for this demographic. The first prisoners arrived in May. There were only a few hundred at the start. These were German women. They were political prisoners, communists, and socialists. Some belonged to religious groups that refused to bow to Adolf Hitler. The regime wanted them silenced forever. But the numbers exploded as the war moved across Europe. The camp filled at a staggering pace. High-speed transports arrived from Poland and Czechoslovakia. Then came the trains from France and the Netherlands. Later, women arrived from Norway and Yugoslavia. By 1942, the arrivals were daily. The camp expanded until it held women from over 40 different countries. The archives show the scale: 130,000 names recorded. The footage from the era is clear. It shows the barbed wire fences and the cold stone walls. The sound of heavy boots on gravel was the only music the prisoners heard. But this was only the beginning. It got worse. The guards did not just watch the prisoners. They organized the labor, managed the starvation, and selected who would go to the gas chambers. In the frame, you can see the empty watchtowers. They stand as silent witnesses to the systematic destruction of human beings. There was no mistake in the design. The Nazis built a factory for death, and they put women in charge of the machinery. The story of Ravensbrück is the story of how ordinary citizens became executioners. The court delivered its verdict years later. But for the victims, the sentence began the moment they stepped off the train. 20 countries, prisoners from across Europe passed through the gates of Ravensbrück. The reasons for their arrest were often minor. Many were Jewish women targeted solely for their ethnicity. Roma women were seized under Nazi racial laws. Thousands of others belonged to underground resistance movements. They smuggled messages, hid fugitives, or destroyed German supply lines. Some did even less. They were arrested for refusing to work in Nazi factories or were caught in random street sweeps. The Gestapo separated entire families. They sent the mothers to Ravensbrück and moved the children to different facilities. This was a system of total displacement. Operating a camp of this scale required a massive workforce. Male SS officers held the senior command roles, but they could not manage thousands of female inmates alone. For daily operations, the SS recruited women as guards. The numbers grew rapidly. At first, there were only a few, then dozens, then hundreds. By the middle of the war, women became a core part of the camp power structure. How did they find them? Recruitment was casual. Some women saw printed advertisements in local newspapers. Others heard about the openings from neighbors or family members already wearing the SS uniform. The Nazi state did not ask for military experience or a high education. The requirements were simple: loyalty to the ideology and a willingness to obey orders. Most recruits came from the working class. The job offered a steady salary, a free uniform, and a place to live. It provided regular meals while the rest of Germany lived on rations. For a poor woman in 1942, it was a career move. Training happened on site. New guards watched roll calls and learned to assign work details. They practiced enforcing discipline. Senior guards taught them how to use physical beatings, extra labor, and solitary confinement. The objective was clear. They had to break the spirit of the prisoners. Among these hundreds of guards, a specific group emerged. They were defined by their authority and their extreme cruelty. They were not just employees, they were the architects of the camp's daily terror. These women became the faces of the regime. 1920. That was the year Dorothea Binz was born in the German village of Templin. Her family was ordinary, working class, and unremarkable. She finished her basic education early and took a job as a maid. Opportunities were few until the Nazi regime expanded. At 19 years old, she volunteered for the SS Women's Auxiliary. The regime sent her straight to Ravensbrück. Binz did not hesitate. From her first days in the camp, she adapted with unsettling speed. The footage from that era shows the uniform: high boots, a dark cape, and a leather riding crop. Binz was never seen without it. She walked through the camp rows with a calm, confident stride. How did a 19-year-old become a monster? At first glance, a simple country girl, but in reality, a cold tactician of fear. Witnesses later described her habit of smiling while she delivered blows. She didn't just follow orders, she invented new ways to enforce discipline. If a prisoner moved too slowly, the crop fell. If a line was uneven, she used her boots. There was no mistake. Binz enjoyed the power. Her commitment was noticed by the high command. Promotions followed quickly. Soon, she held the rank of deputy head of guard training. This role gave her enormous influence over the entire system. Every new female guard who arrived at Ravensbrück passed through her hands. Binz was the instructor. She taught the recruits how to shout, how to humiliate, and how to break the human spirit. She shaped the culture of the camp. Events accelerated as the war reached its final years. In 1944, Greta Boessel arrived at the gates. Her background was different. She was a trained nurse. In the outside world, her profession was associated with healing and care. But in Ravensbrück, the medical uniform took on a different meaning. Boessel served as a guard, but her nursing skills were put to a darker use. She moved between the barracks and the infirmary. The sound of metal trays and surgical tools became a signal of terror. She didn't provide medicine. Instead, she assisted in notorious medical experiments. Surgeons performed procedures that left victims crippled or dead. Boessel watched. She stayed in the room while the screams echoed through the ward. At first glance, a medical professional, but in reality, an accomplice to torture. The transition from nurse to executioner was seamless. She stood by the operating tables as the prisoners were mutilated. By the end of 1944, the camp had become an organized factory of pain. The documents show the result of their work. Thousands of women were broken under their watch. Dorothea Binz and Greta Boessel represented two sides of the same machine. One provided the discipline, the other provided the cold, clinical oversight of suffering. There was no turning back for either of them. The history of the camp was written in the blood of those they oversaw. Thus ended the period of their unchecked power. Mutilated or dead. That was the result of their work. Greta's manner remained cold and detached. She showed no mercy to the sick. Survivors remembered her for a specific task. She selected inmates deemed too weak for labor. She gathered them into groups. She sent them away. Everyone knew they would never return. Who managed the medical hierarchy? One woman held total power, Elizabeth Marshall. She was the camp's head nurse. On paper, her duty was to run the prisoner hospital. In reality, she controlled life and death for thousands. Why did the prisoners fear the clinic? It was a trap. Marshall decided who received medicine and who was refused. Under her watch, hundreds of sick women vanished. Some were moved to killing centers. Others were left on the floor to die without aid. The hospital became a symbol of terror. The violence did not stop there. New names appeared on the roster. Margareta Gallinat was a senior guard during the final years of the war. She was infamous for her temper. She lashed out at prisoners without provocation. No reason was needed. A wrong look was enough for a beating. Erna Peterman held a different kind of power. She managed daily labor assignments. This role determined the fate of every inmate. One woman received backbreaking work. Another received slightly less punishing duties. This was not a small detail. A labor assignment was a death warrant or a temporary reprieve. Gertrude Heise enforced the rules. She was unrelenting. She punished the smallest infractions with extreme cruelty. By the height of the war, these women formed a core power structure inside Ravensbrück. They gave orders without challenge. They assigned punishments on a whim. They decided who lived to see the next sunrise. Backed by the SS system, they feared no consequences. In this world, authority was absolute. Empathy was viewed as a weakness. The screams of the prisoners became background noise. But by 1943, the situation changed. The wider war began to shift. The German front lines were cracking. The tide was turning. There was no way back. Thus, the final phase began. 1944. The German war machine stopped moving forward. Across Europe, the front lines were collapsing. What started as a blitzkrieg had become a frantic retreat. The Nazi leadership realized the end was approaching. Why did the situation inside the camp change? It seemed the walls were isolated from the world. But the chaos of the collapsing Reich reached every corner of the system. The Soviet Red Army was moving from the east. They were not just advancing, they were crushing everything in their path. From the west, British and American bombers dominated the sky. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German industrial centers. Rail lines were twisted metal. Factories were craters. Supply chains vanished. Food vanished. The footage from this era shows the result. Rubble blocked the streets. Civilians stood in breadlines for hours. Soldiers at the front went days without rations. Inside Ravensbrück, this scarcity became a death sentence. At first glance, Ravensbrück was already a place of suffering. But in reality, it was about to become a graveyard. The camp was designed for specific numbers. Now, those numbers meant nothing. Trains arrived at the gates every morning. Hundreds of women stepped off the wooden cattle cars. Guards pushed them toward barracks built for 50 people. Now, 500 women occupied the same space. The camera records the interior, wooden bunks stacked 3 high. There was no space to turn over. Women slept shoulder to shoulder on bare planks. Many ended up on the concrete floor. There were no blankets left. The heating had failed weeks ago. The air was heavy. The smell of unwashed bodies and rot filled the rooms. Lice and fleas covered the walls and the bedding. Typhus and dysentery moved through the barracks like a wildfire. Without medicine, the weak died in their sleep. Hunger became the primary weapon. Rations were reduced to a single piece of gray bread and a bowl of watery soup. It was not enough to sustain life. The prisoners' bodies began to consume themselves. Skin stretched tight over ribs. Eyes became sunken pits. The guards reacted to the pressure of the losing war with increased violence. Their patience disappeared. They watched for any sign of failure. A prisoner stumbled during the morning roll call. A woman looked a guard in the eye. The result was a blow from a rifle butt or a heavy boot. Public executions were no longer rare events. They occurred in the center of the camp. It was a signal to the survivors. Obedience was the only way to delay the end. Every hour was a gamble with death. Conditions accelerated. The Soviet advance pushed into Poland. The SS began a policy of clearing the eastern camps to hide the evidence. They forced thousands of prisoners onto the roads. Ravensbrück became the final destination for these death marches. It was the dumping ground of the Reich. There was no more room, but the trains kept coming. January 1945. Massive rail transfers began. Women from Auschwitz, Majdanek, and smaller satellite camps were forced into overcrowded freight cars. The trains moved slowly toward Ravensbrück. Thousands arrived sick, starving, or on the verge of collapse. The camp population exploded. Infrastructure failed. Deaths became a daily occurrence. How did the system react? It didn't. It broke. Early 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Allied forces closed the gap from the east and the west. The SS faced a crisis of evidence. They had to hide the crimes. The solution was the death marches. Thousands of women were forced out of the gates. They walked for days through the freezing cold. No food, no water. The footage from the era is clear. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles. If a woman collapsed, a guard stepped forward, one shot to the head. The bodies remained in the roadside snow. There was no time for burials. Late April 1945. The war was in its final hours. The front lines reached the camp perimeter. On April 30th, Soviet soldiers entered Ravensbrück. The scale of the slaughter became visible. Out of the hundreds of thousands sent to the camp, only 3,500 remained. The scene was static. Most survivors were too weak to stand. They lay on wooden bunks, unable to move or speak. Some guards were captured at their posts. Others had already vanished. They stripped off their uniforms and fled into the woods, but the hunt began immediately. The Allies wanted justice. Investigators realized the survivors were the key. These women became the primary source of intelligence. They remembered everything. They recalled faces, distinctive accents, surgical scars, and even the specific gait of a guard. Every detail was noted. The British, Soviets, and Poles created a massive database. They cross-referenced camp rosters with interrogation notes and photographs. The archives grew, but the guards were hiding in the chaos of a broken country. At first glance, the search seemed impossible, but in reality, it was systematic. Investigators did not wait for reports. They took to the field. Officers walked through destroyed towns and remote villages. They showed photographs. They asked questions. They looked for men with no papers and fresh stories. The net was closing. The search for the killers had officially started. May 1945. The hunt for the female guards of the Third Reich began in the ruins of Europe. Allied investigators started with the refugee camps. They moved through thousands of displaced people, checking IDs against blacklists. They searched German prisoner records for known names and suspected aliases. No lead was left unchecked. If a woman had served in the SS, she was a target. This was especially true for those who worked in the all-female concentration camps. Investigators brought them in for interrogation, one by one. The women had a script. They claimed they were only clerks. They said they were just nurses or kitchen staff. But the survivors remembered. In the interrogation rooms, former prisoners looked at the suspects. They recognized the faces instantly. How were the worst offenders finally caught? The process was cold and methodical. Dorothea Binz was arrested in May 1945. She was not alone. She was caught alongside her fiancé, a fellow SS officer from a different camp. Greta Boessel was next. She tried to blend into the civilian population, dressing in ordinary clothes and walking the streets of destroyed cities. She hoped to disappear. She failed. Elizabeth Marshall took a different path. She moved into a quiet neighborhood and took a job as a nurse. She acted like a common citizen with a clean past. Then there was Gertrude Heisey. British forces found her hiding in their occupied zone. They did not keep her. They handed her over to the Polish authorities. Poland was the home of her victims. It was the place where justice would be served. The net was closing. For years, these women had operated above any law. Now, they were powerless. In the footage from the time, their heads are bowed. By the end of 1946, the cells were full. The British military had enough evidence for a massive legal proceeding. This became known as the First Ravensbrück trial. It was held in Hamburg under the authority of British military courts. The trial began in December 1946. The courtroom was cold. In the dock sat 16 defendants. Among them were 3 former male staff members. The era of impunity was over.